This lecture will focus on the farmers that came out to the frontier and kind of settled the West. The Great Plains is kind of the area that we're going to talk about here, and you can see it on this map here. It's this huge prairie. So prairies, remember, a grassland, and it's this giant grassland just west of the Mississippi River, and then east of the Rocky Mountains. So kind of between those two is this giant grassland that we call the Great Plains. Now, in 1819, when Major Stephen Long went out there and explored it, he called it the Great American Desert. It was seen as a mostly useless, very difficult to live in piece of land. And so the first thing I guess I want to talk about is some of the challenges of living out there. As these new settlers came in and were trying to farm in the area, they found all of these challenges to be very, very difficult. There were very hot summer temperatures, up to 100 degrees. They're trying to make it through that and deal with the heat in the summer. And then, of course, coming in also in the summer, these swarms of grasshoppers would run through sometimes and destroy like their entire fields of crops. And there was pretty much nothing they could do about it because you can't really fight the bugs one at a time when there's millions of them. And then there were prairie fires that came through and were a constant issue. If it got dry with those high heats, fires were a major problem. In the winter, there were blizzards and extreme cold, so your house had to be able to handle the heat of the summer and the extreme cold blizzards of the winter. Trees didn't naturally grow in the area because it was a big grassland. And so they only really grew down by rivers, and so you didn't have any trees. You didn't have an easy source of wood, which made it difficult to have fires. It also made it difficult to build your house or build anything with wood because you didn't have access to any. And then water was way deep in the ground. To get a hold of it, you had to go in some places 100 feet deep just to get to any water. And so these were all the challenges that the people or the very early people of the Great Plains had to deal with as far as of the Americans coming in. And so, how did they deal with let's talk about one of the issues. We're talking about not having trees to build your houses, not having wood. All right. What they built the homes out of was sod. So basically they took this what you would, if you put a shovel through the ground, right, and there's that dense like dirt and roots and stuff all together that's kind of all like a piece, that's called sod. And so they would take those and they'd essentially make bricks out of them and build their entire house out of bricks of dirt and grass. All right. So these homes were built in that way, and that's just the way that they lived at that time. So even despite all of the difficulties in the late 1800s, a whole lot of people started to come out to the West, right, to the Great Plains. And the reason that they did this is because the railroads had gotten land grants. So the railroads got land grants from the government to help pay for the railroad. And what they did is all this land that was close to the railroad, they sold off. And so they sold it to make money to pay for the railroad. And so they own these big chunks of land right by the tracks that they have been given by the government. And they took it and they sold it to settlers, and they sold it for cheap. They advertised it all across America and Europe and Canada. They were trying to get anybody who needed land or wanted to, change their life and get new opportunity. They advertised for them to come out, and tons of people came to buy land in the frontier, in the Great Plains. And then that cheap land, even more than that cheap land, the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed people to go out and get free land. So basically what you did is you went through the government, you signed up, you paid just a small fee, and you were able to claim a homestead. So you were able to claim land up to 160 acres for free, and all you had to do was live there for 5 years and continue to improve it and continue to survive. So if you live there and survive for 5 years, you got that land for free. It cost you absolutely nothing. 160 acres. That's amazing. And so that their property rights that they had with that, given this 160 acres of land for free or for very cheap, they could buy it. plus the ability for the railroads that are now there right next to this land are bringing supplies out. More and more settlers found it easier to live on the plains, right? And so they started to come out and live on the plains, and so the population started to grow all around this frontier of the Great Plains. And so with farming and with these sod houses that we talked about, which you got a nice picture of one up here, there also came innovations in farming to try and make it easier in this area. What kind of showing you the government's desire for that innovation is seen in this 1862 act called the Morrill Land Grant College Act. And basically what that did is they set aside 30,000 acres essentially, okay, here's how it works. So they gave 30,000 acres to a college for them to sell, right? And with that money, they got to make colleges. But those colleges had to be focused on agriculture and mechanical arts. So inventing for agriculture, making farming better. Some of the innovations that came out of this, dry farming is one of them, and that was really important in the Great Plains. It was a method of planting seeds very, very deep so that there was enough moisture for the seeds to actually grow. So you'd plant it deeper than just a normal eastern farm. And, the tools that they were inventing and that had already been invented were being used to do this: plows, threshers, seed drills, reapers. All of these things that had been invented really made this possible. But also all of these people coming in and busting up this sod, busting up that grassroots that was holding in all of the dirt and all of the topsoil, that had some issues as well. That had some environmental issues because a lot of these sod busters, these people that plowed and lived in the plains, the people that broke up that sod, they left the top dirt exposed because now that grass seed was gone. And so now this dirt was exposed, and in the windy conditions without many trees to block it and stuff like that in the Great Plains, a lot of people during droughts especially lost their entire homestead to erosion because they were cutting up this land and over farming it, and all of the good soil went away. It's called desertification when you over farm and you use up too much of the nutrients in the soil and wreck it. So a lot of people lost their homestead and were not able to go the entire 5 years because they ruined their land with over farming. The new machines, there were a lot of new machines that worked really well to harvest wheat. So there were things like, like steam tractors and stuff like that. And like that you could buy these mechanical reapers that would come through and do the reaping for you, and steam tractors that allowed you to get more and more crops. So one person could get a lot more crops than before. And these machines called threshing machines were invented that would knock away the loose kernels from the stalks of wheat and corn and stuff like that. And then there were binders, mechanical binders that would automatically tie up the stalks into bundles so that they were easy to grab, easy to sell. And all of this worked really well for the crop of wheat, which also, the nice thing about wheat was it really lived quite well in the dry, harsh conditions of the Great Plains. And so some of these wheat farms became these huge farms that were made, and they were called Bonanza Farms at the time. Bonanza Farms were these giant farms that had really big profits, and then they would take those profits and buy more property and more equipment and get bigger and get more profits, and then just continue to reinvest and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Take a moment to write out your answer for checkpoint number 1. So wheat became this really, really big crop. It became very, very important to America, and it really still is pretty important to America at this point. But it was all or mostly grown in the wheat belt, which was an area on the edge of the eastern part of the Great Plains. It was in like North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of Nebraska and Kansas. And again, these Bonanza farms were popping up over there, and they were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so very quickly, by the 1880s, the United States became the #1 exporter of wheat in the entire world. Remember, a fairly new country still at that point, and becoming this this natural resource kind of powerhouse in the world. But then, as all good things tend to come to an end, there was a drought. A drought is a long period without rain, and it dries up the land. And so the land dried up, and of course, this newly exposed land that doesn't have the grass to hold in, the roots to hold in the soil, that topsoil was destroyed. Okay, so the crops went away because you couldn't water, or they weren't able to water them. Didn't have big irrigation systems like we have now. And so those crops died, and then the soil lost all of its nutrients. The topsoil blew away. It was a very, very difficult time for farmers. And then in the 1890s, a worldwide surplus of wheat brought the prices of wheat way down. So the price was a lot lower for all the wheat that they were selling, and so the farmers were really struggling. They tried to make it through, and many of these farmers started to mortgage their farm. And to mortgage means to borrow money, but if you can't pay it back, they get your land. So most people have a mortgage on their house. Like I have a mortgage on my house, and essentially it's I borrowed enough money to buy my house, but I have to pay back. And if I can't pay it back, if I don't pay it back, they'll just take my house. All right, so you're kind of saying, yes, I'm borrowing a lot of money from you. I will pay back. If you don't, then you can have my property. You can have my house. You can have my whatever. And so a lot of them mortgaged their farms, which became really, really difficult for them as the prices started to go down of wheat, and they had less and less money, and they were just trying to borrow to make it through it, and it became more difficult. A lot of farmers lost their land, and when they lost their land, instead of being farmers, they rented their own land that had already been theirs and continued to farm on it as tenant farmers. And so that was very difficult. In about 1900, about a third of the farmers in the Great Plains had lost their farms to the banks and were now tenant farmers renting from them. So it was a hard time for farmers. And soon thereafter, we see that most of all this new land that was brand new and out there and nobody knew about and wasn't settled or anything like that, it started to get settled. And so really the frontier, this new place that you can go and explore, was kind of closing. There wasn't really much frontier left. This happened in 1889, basically. Oklahoma was open to settlement in April 22nd of 1889, and thousands of people rushed in to claim the land within hours. And so these Oklahomans that now had taken over this last piece of land that was frontier before, that actually belonged to the natives, but had been taken away. So really there wasn't a true frontier anymore left in America. There was a lot of unclaimed land, so settlement continued and people were able to continue to buy land for cheap and homestead and things like that, but there wasn't this new unexplored large chunk of land that you could go to. And so that changed America. It was very different for America. And Frederick Jackson Turner, this man over here, really was concerned about that change because he thought that the frontier gave us what he called a safety valve for social discontent. So if you're unhappy where you are in society, if you're unhappy because you don't have enough money, because whatever, your religion is being persecuted or whatever, you always had this frontier where you could go out and make a fresh start. You could make a fresh start with your family, or you could make a fresh start with your people or your religion or whatever, and now that was gone. The opportunity for a fresh start within the lands of America was gone, which he thought would probably take away some of the draw and allure of living in America and being an American. And so as these people were settling, though, they started to adapt to the plains and kind of figure out ways to make their lives, and a lot of people lived on the plains and lived quite happily. And this was because if they couldn't get wood, the railroads were able to bring it. So any supplies that they were not able to get where they were at, the railroads were able to bring those out, and they could buy them from them. The water that they got from the wells, they would just dig that 100 feet down into these giant aquifers, and they were able to get water, and that allowed them to plant, that allowed them to water their plants and their gardens and whatever else. And really, most of the farmers in the Great Plains, they weren't able to get rich. They were just kind of having a good life and building something for their family, and you know, building their homes, building their communities, and working really, really hard to do that. So it was a hard life, but it was a rewarding life, and they were, you know, able to build their own thing, their own communities. Take a moment to write 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.